Hey everybody, what you're going to see right here is a premiere of a new format called Deep Devils. It is with an individual by the name of Joe, who I met at CrimeCon. He and I hit it off famously. He writes by JJ on the State of the Deep Substack page. He's got stateofthedeep.substack.com as his Substack address. Here is a special preview of the type of show that Joe and I are going to do called Deep Devils. Hope you enjoy the premiere and let me know what you think. All right. Hey, everybody. I want to introduce you to Joe. He also writes by JJ State of the Deep. He has the State of the Deep on Substack. And I want to tell you a little bit about Joe. But Joe, first of all, thank you for coming on to the show and coming up with this collaboration idea, what we're calling Deep Devils. How are you doing today?
I'm good, man. We're back.
I know we're back. It was super exciting meeting you at CrimeCon, and I want to tell people a little bit about how Joe and I met at CrimeCon. I got this email from this guy who was saying, or I think it was an email. I'm not even sure. I think it was an email. Yeah, and he was like, "Hey, I see that you're coming out to Denver, Colorado for CrimeCon. If possible, I'd like to meet you." And I said, "Yeah, that sounds great." And it was funny. When we met, he hadn't started. I don't think you made it to day one of CrimeCon, right? You didn't start going until the second day, I think.
Yeah, we met for a drink the night before Saturday, so it was Friday night after the event.
Yeah, and it was funny because I kind of teased you about this before, but when I met Joe, one of the first things he says, "Hey, I want to make sure you're clear. Like, I'm not a fan." And at first I was like, "What the hell does that mean? I'm not a fan?" But I think what you meant, and I totally get it, was I'm not a fanboy who's driving in because oh my god, I get to meet the devil's advocates. It was more like, "Hey, I like what you do, and I think we could hang out and have a good time and talk." And so that was the way we kind of started, and we sat down to bullshit at this bar after a day of CrimeCon. And I have to say, Joe blew me away with our conversation was just so light and effortless, and you and I were riffing on a million conspiracy theories that just were happening so fast. It was insane that night.
Yeah, I mean, when I reached out to you, it was essentially, well, I became aware of your videos through the Idaho 4 case, right? So
Yeah,
I I like the way you present your ideas, and I thought, you know what, I could definitely rap with this guy about this case, share some ideas, trade ideas. So that was my original motivation to reach out to you. I figured, he's going to be going to CrimeCon. I'm in Colorado. I was on vacation at the time, so I thought, I've never been to like a convention of that sort. So maybe I'll go. I'll check it out. I'll meet this guy. We could shoot the shit about stuff, see if we're on the same page. And more so, I didn't go to the event solely. Like you said it yourself, it's a very pro law enforcement, pro sort of mainstream narrative event,
yeah,
which is sort of at odds with the way that I think. And I kind of
right,
got from you that you think the same way. And so
correct,
really
yeah.
that was my motivation. And when you were like, "Yeah, man, let's meet up," I was happy to get a chance to meet up and exchange ideas. And it was really all based on the Idaho 4 case initially.
Yeah, and I think the first session, in fact, that you went to because you got a ticket for Saturday was because Authorum Labs. I think that wasn't that the first session that you and I both attended together was a session on Authorum Labs.
I
And I
think
want to
I
get to
think that's
that.
the only session that I attended.
Right. Actually, you were in large part a reason why I missed a large part of Saturday's Crime Con because we got so wrapped into Authorum Labs and the spin-off conversation from that you and I literally couldn't stop talking. We had another individual, Penny, who came who was there watching CrimeCon that watches our show a lot, and we got all riffing about it for so long that it was like, wow, we just missed like 5 episodes or 5 sessions. Maybe we should jump in the car and go check out the theater where the Aurora, Colorado shooting is, because that was something we talked about on Friday night as well. Ended up down in Denver that night. It was just an amazing moment where I was like, I'm willing to miss a whole bunch of sessions just to hang out and talk to you. I want to talk about that Authorum Labs thing because again, we have so much that we're going to cover on this show. To get a little bit ahead, before we get back to Authorum Labs, and the first kind of thing that Joe and I noticed at the Authorum Labs presentation was we had a lot of things in common, and he knew things about the stories behind the stories, what I would call foundational stuff. And so very, very quickly, Joe and I started to realize that, hey, there's a place for us to talk about the foundation behind why do people say Idaho 4 is a giant conspiracy? Why do they say things like this is a psyop? Why do they, like, what does that even mean, a psyop? And so Joe and I kind of realized we both had a passion and an understanding about what a psyop is, or what deep state politics are and things like that. And so that began the wheels were in motion already, right, Joe? For you and I, were like, wow, like we have a passion for educating the public about the story, the foundational stuff that they're missing behind these stories. And then comes Authorum Labs. And we don't really know a lot about each other, you and I, but we're sitting beside each other. We're not talking, but we got our phones in our hand. And most of the way through Authorum Labs presentation, and I've done plenty of videos about this before, where I was like, holy shit, like, this is just a promotional vehicle for Authorum Labs. Like, this, everything around me was starting to realize, like, are we here just promoting Authorum Labs? And I was thinking I was kind of by myself. And then I get a phone text message on my phone, bleep, look down, and Joe's like, this is just a promotional vehicle for Authorum Labs. And I was like, this dude is on it. You want to talk a little bit about what you saw there on that stage that day?
Yeah, in fact, I remember the 2 text messages I sent to you during the presentation. Quickly, I got the opinion, and I sussed out that this is an investor fundraising event, because essentially that's what the whole thing was. I initially thought they were going to talk about specifics of the case and different suspects that they had to test and things like that. And it turned out they immediately locked in on the official story and pushing Authorum Labs, right? Really, it seemed like an investor fundraiser. And then the second,
yeah, I was gonna say, I just feel like what was impressive to me is, like, looking around that room of 1,000 something people that were in that packed house on Authorum Labs. I felt like you and I are like, I swear, like, we're the only 2 people that get this. Like, I'm looking around, like, is anybody else getting that this is just a promotional vehicle for Authorum Labs? And here you are texting, like, what the hell's this about? And I'm like, I think we're the only people in this room of 1,000 people, or whatever it was, that's getting what's happening right now.
Well, do you remember what the second text I sent you was?
I want to look into who's invested in Authorum Labs, something to that effect. Was that it? Yeah.
Yeah. And just because I got the immediate impression that they were pitching, it was basically fundraising. And I thought, what does this remind me of? And sure enough, when I looked into who the key investors were, there were 3 main investors. One was GigaFund, which is the company that funds a lot of Elon Musk's projects. There was another one, I believe it was called Illumina or Illuma, maybe Illumina. And I can't remember what the third one was. What I looked into is who's invested in those companies, because oftentimes it's once removed or twice removed. And sure enough, the top 2 investors in Illumina or Illuma, I'll have to look that up, I can't remember, but were Vanguard and BlackRock, 2 of the largest investment firms in the world.
And I remember,
by the way, real quick, BlackRock owns Vanguard now. So they're it's actually one company.
Yeah, very good. And it's funny because I remember when you said that, I kind of countered a little bit, but it made me impressed about you, because I kind of countered and I said, well, that isn't a surprise, because they own practically everything. Like, they're invested in everything. But you knew that as well. But and so, I mean, immediately, of course, when you see BlackRock involved with anything, but this is the heart of what I'm getting at, is that behind all these stories, there's a reason why people like you and I, when we see the name like Vanguard, or we see BlackRock, and we see these major investment companies, and they're involved in at the heart of all kinds of conspiracies with things that make them money, crisis that make them money, we always go, of course they're involved. But again, the counter could be, well, they're invested in everything in America. But it was just, that was kind of the start of me realizing you and I are in lockstep. We were like, I mean, I was immediately saying to you I think when we got out of the session, maybe it was when I said, I want to know, are they publicly traded? What's their, who is investing in this company? I bet you we're going to find senators. We're going to find, people in high level of government who's invested in Authorum Labs before they just blew up off the face of the map with, by the way, we caught Brian Koberger in 5 days and we're going to be the next big thing. And I'm like, why? Gee, I wonder who invested in Vanguard, or sorry, in Authorum Labs. But now, as you saw, they were privately funded by a bunch of big investors that, again, always seem to be at the heart of all these conspiracies and shit and crisis that they make money off of, and so on.
Yeah, and we'll get into hopefully a lot more the relevance of that, like why that's significant. That sort of touches on the foundational ideas that we discussed in pretty good detail.
Yeah. And I think that's what one of the things that we want to do. And like, to try to make my audience understand why we're doing this, for example, it's not going to be directly, hey, we're talking about Idaho 4 tonight. Although I want to talk to you a bit more about Idaho 4, because that's how you started in this thing and me. But anyways, it's not directly about Idaho 4 or directly about Charlie Kirk, which, by the way, we're also going to talk a little bit about, because we have a big passion for the Charlie Kirk story. And that's what really launched Deep Devil's idea, probably more than anything. But it's the fact that there's a foundational pieces behind all of these stories. Why is it, because some people would accuse me, well, you're a conspiracy theorist. Of course you don't believe that Brian Koberger actually did the murders. You got to come up with some elaborate conspiracy, and there's all this, the police are doing stuff and whatever. And now all of a sudden, Luigi Mangione really didn't shoot Brian Thompson. It's some big conspiracy and there's money involved. And yet, you and I both know, follow the money is something that you always do. And there often is extra motives involved in these stories. And so we wanted to talk about what's going on behind the news stories.
Right. And I think it's hard for a lot of people, and I can totally understand why, to conceive of the idea that powerful people would carry out nefarious acts. But if you just look at history, there's a long and storied history behind how powerful entities, powerful financial interests, have a hand in a lot of these things that have been oftentimes declassified, things that have happened, but the media does not talk about it. So the mainstream media doesn't dig into these types of things. And guess what? They're funded by these same powerful, financial interests. So there's a common thread that runs through a lot of these things. And a lot of people are not aware of that because the mainstream media doesn't talk about it, because they're funded by the same interests that are
And I think
connected to a lot of things.
I think that's where you and I really connected to, is we really believe that there's a controlled narrative in the media, right? The media is bought and paid for in a lot of ways by the government, and what the government wants the media to say is what they're going to say. And that led you to riffing at length about the Smith-Mundt Modernization Act. And even I was like, what the hell are you talking about? Like, because that phrase, the Smith-Mundt Act, I wasn't familiar with it when you brought it up. And I was trying to remember in my memory bank what the hell you're talking about. And then it was funny, I was talking to Bertie Bombshells one night and he talked about the Smith-Mundt Modernization Act. So I had to get reboned up on this kind of thing. And I think we want to talk about that because I think it leads to the conspiracy theory idea that our government literally is authorized to propagandize the American public and use the media as a wing of propaganda. Maybe we're getting ahead of ourselves. I don't know. You want to riff on that right now, or do you want to save that for a little bit later in this discussion?
Well, just as a quick sort of synopsis of what Smith-Mundt is.
Yeah.
In 1947, the CIA was created. It basically came out of the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which was a wartime intelligence agency. That was the whole premise behind the OSS. In 1947, after World War II, they created the CIA. And I won't go too deep into it because we can get much deeper into that another time, because that's a whole episode in and of itself.
And we will get into that kind of stuff, because that's exactly what this show is about, is getting deeper into those subjects.
Right. And so that was 1947. In 1948, the Smith-Mundt Act was created. And I'm going to give a real basic overview. The whole purpose of it was to prevent the CIA and the government from using the type of operations they use overseas, which is we've always done propaganda campaigns in other countries, to prevent them from doing it here, from propagandizing American citizens.
And I want to, if you don't mind, I want to explain to the people a little bit about what American propaganda is to foreign countries and what it looks like. The basic idea was there was things like Voice of America and stuff like that would basically promote worldwide journalism that was designed to look like the news, just the news, but and they would tell news stories that always painted America in the best light, always made us look like we're the champions of the world, we're the freedom fighters, we're trying to liberate everybody from their oppressive regimes. We're the best place to live. Our cities are amazing. We have very minimal problems in the United States, and everybody else is living in a shithole. I grew up in that era where I believed even the stuff that was being said to foreign countries about everybody else lives in a shithole and we live in the best place to live. That was part of the propaganda machine, right, that the outside world was supposed to see, but not us. And there was actually this rule put in place that, hey, look, Americans shouldn't be seeing the propaganda that we're putting out to the foreign countries to make it look like we're the best shit on since sliced bread.
Right. And a big justification for a lot of that propaganda was a couple of different things depending on what era you look at. But initially it was forwarding Western ideas in other countries around the world so they would accept American operations
democracy
around the world, both like financial and diplomatic operations. And then in the Cold War, the justification was we have to stop the spread of communism. So that ties into another concept that we can get into at a later time, manufacturing consent, which Noam Chomsky wrote a famous book about it. It's called Manufacturing Consent. It's a really famous history book. So anyway, but that's a whole other rabbit hole right there. But so because of the CIA's creation in 1947, and there were people that were aware of what could potentially happen in America, that's when they came up with the Smith-Mundt Act. In 2012, under Obama, it was basically rewritten, and it's a pretty complicated thing, but it's real easy to go online and get a summary of it. And essentially, now they always use tricky wording, but essentially it allows the government and all the government's proxies, which would include the mainstream media. It would also include educational institutions. It would include anything that gets any kind of either funding from the government or has a connection to the government. It allows them to propagandize people. And the last thing I'll say, because we're going to dive a lot more into this stuff, but the last thing I'll say is that a big misconception, and I totally understand it, that people have is that the media is obligated to tell them the truth. Of course, it's the news. They can't just lie to us. But the reality is they actually are allowed to lie to you. If it's coming from, the word of the government or U.S. intelligence, by law, they are allowed to lie or propagandize people.
And I think it's important. I think it's important for people to understand that the dates that you gave, like 2012, was it for the Modernization Act of Smith-Mundt, that takes us past September 11th. And the reason why I think that's important is because we had a lot of propaganda in the United States going out there about September 11th and about how we were attacked and how we needed to come open up democracy, a can of democracies on everyone's ass all around the world. But the problem is that, and the way I see it, maybe you wouldn't pitch it this way, Joe, but the problem is that we became more and more global as a society. There wasn't this it's not like people were listening to the radio now to get their news. Everybody could jump on the internet and see stories. And so a lot of that propaganda about, even in my opinion, for weapons of mass destruction. Oh, Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction. We got to go take over and invade Kuwait and take over. All of that would have been typical propaganda for the outside world. You guys are horrible. You guys are out of control. We have to come stop your horrible regime and put an end to it. But now it was like worldwide, and Americans are watching it all the time. And that was kind of their justification for doing the modernization of the Smith-Mundt, which is to say, basically, look, Americans are seeing our propaganda, and we can't stop them from. The law was supposed to stop, basically Americans from seeing propaganda being put out to the rest of the world, but we can't stop them. It's a global society. So we're just going to roll it back and say, you know what? No longer do we have to worry about protecting America from our own propaganda machine. We can now just say they're going to watch the propaganda as well, which essentially is the same way of saying it's okay now to use propaganda against your own population.
Right. And again, this ties into financial interests, right? The defense contractors, if there's not war, then they don't make money, and neither do their shareholders, right? So
right.
If you can manufacture consent there, and when that's going to come up a lot, for war, for giving up rights, right? That's a lot of what it is. It's happening a lot in the last 5 or 6 years, where through the media, they manufacture consent for people giving up civil liberties. And I look at things that more broadly. I don't give a shit about politics. I think it's all BS. And there's a lot
Another
of
thing
evidence.
we have in common.
Yeah, and there's a lot that will prove that. I mean, if you really look into it. And so a lot of the stuff related to propaganda, it's financial interest, but they pitch it as it's for your own safety, right? That's the Patriot Act, right?
Yeah.
Just look
right.
at the NDAA, right? I believe it's like the National Defense Authorization Act or something like that. I apologize if I got that wrong. But a lot of this stuff ties into that, and getting people, keep people scared, make them believe they need your protection and it's for your own good. And that goes back many, many years. And
Joe, I have to ask you, do you remember I really don't remember. So I'm asking if you remember. It's a famous saying, and I can't remember who coined it. Something to the effect of, if you trade liberty and freedom for security, then you have neither. You know what I'm talking about? Do you remember that saying? Because what they want to do is they want to convince you that, look, to keep you safe, you're just going to have to give up some of your freedoms. We're going to have more mass surveillance. We're going to have to invade your privacy a little bit, because if you want to be protected from the bad guys, we need to have more access. And somebody famously quoted the line, if you trade liberty or freedom for security, then you have neither.
Yeah, it's something like, I don't know it word for word. It might have been Ben Franklin, where it's like,
it was someone like that, like a founding father.
Yeah, someone who would trade liberty for security deserves neither liberty nor security, or something to that effect.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, essentially, just look at where society has gone, just in the last 5.5 years. And it's on a global scale. And it's a lot of what's happening now. And if I could I'll end with this, because it'll tie into things we're going to talk about later. What's happening with the Charlie Kirk situation. I talked to you about this. I said, this is going to be used to forward the interests of the companies that are engaged in predictive policing and domestic surveillance. I predicted that. I was watching the Charlie Kirk thing unfold from the second that it happened. I just happened to be online on Reddit when a video popped up of the assassination right after it happened. And immediately I started thinking, if in fact this was some sort of an operation, and we're going to talk a lot about why it looks like that, or it may be that, they're going to use it because the old saying, never let a good crisis go to waste.
Right.
Well, I would argue that certain entities create crises, but that's a whole other discussion.
It's not a jump, right? It's not that big of a jump. Yeah, exactly.
Right. And so everything has a purpose. Everything that the government does, every piece of legislation always seems to be tied to big money interests. So we're gonna talk a lot more about that, I'm sure, with the Charlie
Yeah,
Kirk
in fact,
situation.
I want to mention that a little bit because again, what happened was Joe and I were already kind of talking, about his Substack channel, State of the Deep, and how he was into that kind of stuff. And I was saying, man, I'd really like to do some foundational stuff for people to, explain to them why people say it's a psyop. If nobody really died in Idaho for it was a big psyop. And we started talking about that. We were bouncing these ideas around, and literally, it was days after leaving Aurora, Colorado, or Denver, Colorado. I had driven through Utah. And literally, I'm getting home within days of that, and Charlie Kirk shot in Utah. It was kind of a surreal moment. And immediately, you and I started talking about Charlie Kirk, and there was this immediate like, oh shit, this is going to blow up off the face of the planet. And there is a million reasons to believe that was a flat out political assassination. There's more to this story than they say. You and I started riffing immediately on the idea that when these kind of things happen, it serves more than one agenda. That was one of the big things that you were big on me about, is you're like, look, when this happens, it's not going to be just because Kirk was talking about Jeffrey Epstein and pushing for those files. It's not just because he was starting to make waves in the political party and maybe the future president, possibly by some people. It's because of all those things. When you've got a bunch of competing narratives that are all lining up, it increases the likelihood that person's it makes sense to assassinate them because it meets multiple agendas.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we've talked a lot about what we want to do with these videos, and one of the things that I believe in, and I think we need more of, is rather than divisive narratives that pit sides against each other, is to talk about things like, we've said this a million times, foundational ideas. Why do we think these things could be ops? Why do we think there could be more nefarious things at play than what the media tells you? It's all based on verifiable things that you can point to. And the more people that understand that and learn about those types of foundational things, I think the more likelihood that people will start realizing that we may disagree about a lot of things and no one's going to agree on everything. But in the end, we're actually all on the same team, so to speak. And that if enough people wake up to that, it might take a long time, but at the direction we're going now and at the rate we're moving in that direction, things do not look good for society. And so
I think I don't want you to lose this point that you're making, which is that I hope that I can summarize what you're just saying, which is that when people start to realize, at the end of the day, a lot of us are a lot less divided than they want us to believe. When you start to realize what we will try to lay out for you is that there is a reason why they want to force liberalism versus conservatism, why they want to, they purposely divide the country and get you to be fighting with each other, when a lot of that's manufactured, because the everyday Joe Blow sitting down at the coffee isn't as radical as they want you to believe everyone is. And so they keep us fighting with each other. They foment anger. They make people feel divided. And in reality, the average guy would probably rather come together and learn to solve our differences, but they want to keep us fighting each other.
Right. And I think it's important also to emphasize the point of why people like us question things on a deeper level, because it's not about, I don't go to conspiracy theory websites. I don't read conspiracy theory books. I read historical accounts of a lot of the things that have happened. And so again, it's real easy to label somebody a conspiracy theorist and dismiss them by doing that. So with the true crime stuff, it's important that people understand why it gets questioned. Like, can I just give you an example that applies to all these cases?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll use the Idaho 4 as just a quick example. Why wouldn't the media acknowledge that the reason people are questioning these narratives and the testimony of the surviving roommates is because it doesn't add up?
Right.
right? But
Right.
instead, what they do is, oh, these a lot of crazy conspiracies floating around online, right? How about if they were real, if the media was a real source of information that sought out the truth, they would say, yeah, I can kind of see why people are questioning things. These stories don't add up. Like, why weren't the two surviving roommates questioned about the 8 hour delay? Why weren't they investigated at all beyond, apparently a brief investigation before they were cleared? So it's really
Yeah,
about what.
why doesn't the media push for, why do we have a unprecedented gag order in the first place? Why does everything need to be private and sealed and why can't we have transparency? Why can't we talk about it? If you had a real media, in my opinion, a real media that was detached from the government, they'd be pressing, why do we have to have this secret? Maybe you're part of the reason why all of this talk is happening, because you won't tell us what's happening. But instead, they're all locked up narrative. Everybody's a crazy nutbag if you start coming up with conspiracies, even though they should be pushing for, why don't we have transparency? Why isn't media asking the questions that you and I have to ask? Why is it we're labeled as conspiracy theorists if we ask the questions that traditionally media should have been asking? But somewhere along the line, media stopped asking the tough questions and just went along with the narrative.
Right. I mean, look at how journalism has changed. I don't watch any mainstream media. I watch and I listen to and read independent journalists, like award-winning journalists like Matt Taibbi and Glenn Greenwald. Glenn Greenwald was the guy who broke the Edward Snowden story. People like Max Blumenthal that were ousted from the publications that they worked for because they didn't go along with all the narratives that they were told to. And so there's a lot more, uh, many more independent journalists than that, but that's just a couple off the top of my head. And look at, in the past, there were books that were written by real journalists like Gary Webb, who wrote Dark Alliance about the whole Sandinistas and the Contras in Nicaragua, which we know where that story ended up leading and what got exposed. Right nowadays, you never see any mainstream journalism that even touches things like that. And
Instead they often get fired, and then they have to go get their own channel and start becoming independent, because if they work for the major channels, they get fired if they don't go along with the narrative.
right, I mean, even some of the so-called independent journalists that have gone on their own, like Megyn Kelly and others that are pretty big, um, pretty big content creators that have huge channels, they rarely stray too far from the mainstream narrative. And a
Yeah.
lot of those people are moving to podcasts now because the mainstream media is dying and they need to get people that are fairly establishment friendly in those spaces. And because they saw the success of Joe Rogan's podcast and they're like, all right, we got to catch up. We have to start getting into that space. And yeah, I mean, essentially, we could talk all night just about this one topic, but I think that provides a basic foundation about some of the ways that we will look at things going forward.
Yeah, and just to let you know, earlier in this conversation, you were talking just briefly about the history of the CIA and when it started and how it came out of the OSS. And I had recently just started a document review from a book that you had recommended, which is the One Nation Under Blackmail by Whitney Webb. And you were like, hey, look, because when Charlie Kirk thing happened, I said, oh my God, this is going to be related to Epstein. And you're like, well, you know what? If you haven't read it, you need to be reading that book because it talks about the Epstein connection, whatever. And I'm like, okay, so I immediately got it. And I have done before on this channel book reviews where I read chapter after chapter and read the highlighted parts and try to educate people on the book. And I'm doing that now with One Nation Under Blackmail, and it's an enormous work. I think it's 800 pages for the first volume, and I think there's a volume 2. So, shit, I don't even. But anyways, point being is right off the bat, that book was talking about the OSS and the establishment of the CIA right in the first chapters. And so these are the kind of things that Joe and I we're gonna use those kind of things like those books and whatever, and we're gonna try to break it down into plain English and explain to people, because not everybody wants to sit down and read a dry book, but maybe having two guys that understand the foundations of these things can talk about it and put it in plain language will be a benefit to everybody.
Yeah, and I think, look, I'm not all, dead serious about everything all the time. I can look at things and I have kind of a dark sense of humor, so I can see the absurdity in things and the humor in that absurdity, you know? And I mean, just look at the horse shit that's fed to us by the mainstream media. It's insane. People
Yeah.
believe some of the things that people believe are so preposterous solely because it's coming from the quote unquote news. I mean, it's it blows my mind, man. I have to laugh at it sometimes because I mean, just look at the cases that we've talked about. Look at
Yeah.
the Idaho 4 case. You get criticized for questioning things. It's like this is
Yeah.
the most convoluted and upside down narrative I've ever seen. And
Well,
it's
I think this is a great place to kind of maybe kind of wrap up eventually on this show right here is let's talk about Idaho 4 because one of the things that you said to me very, very early on, because like you said, you kind of started getting into this rabbit hole about the Idaho 4 thing. I think you said something to the effect of you've never seen one case that has as many crazy shit as like alternate conspiracy theories and stuff like that as Idaho 4. Didn't you say something to that effect?
yeah, I just said there's so many incongruent details in this case, man. It's insane. Like
So
just right
go
from
ahead.
the get-go. Do you want me to give you my intro into that case real quick?
Yeah, absolutely. I was gonna say what got you started. What was your first thoughts on the case?
Okay. So I don't really watch the mainstream media. So when the case first happened, I didn't even know about it for a few days. And then I think I was on YouTube and I was looking at some videos or whatever. And then I saw somebody did a video. You know, there were people that early on jumped on the Idaho 4 case. And once I heard some of the details, like first of all, the fact that they were all stabbed to death, brutally stabbed to death, and that there was an 8-hour delay between when the crime allegedly happened to when the roommates called 911. I was like, wow, that's crazy. And then I started following it religiously. And right from the get go, the first thing that I thought of is okay, it's because rumors were flying right from the get go. Oh, it was a big party house. I even remember one rumor that a guy was dropping somebody off, either like an Uber or cab driver or whatever, and he said, "Oh yeah, that's the house where people go to get drugs." And again, I'm stating that that was just a rumor,
Yeah.
but I thought, yeah, it's a party house, a bunch of kids that are popular, they're active on social media. I've lived in houses like that when I was younger. And there was always somebody either in that house or attached to it that was dealing drugs. I mean, that's just a reality. Anybody who's went to college or has hung out around party houses knows that. It's not a controversial statement. And so I thought, all right, the 8-hour delay, what would make the most sense to me, knowing what little information we have so far? I thought either they had a stash in the house that needed to be cleaned out. Um, I mean, that's the first thing that I thought of is all right, that would explain the 8-hour delay. And also, it would explain their need to change their story because nobody's going to admit to the police, oh, you know, we had to clean the house out. And they're not going to admit that they saw what happened and knew what happened as it was happening or right after. They're not going to admit to that, right? Because they needed a reason to explain the 8-hour delay. And so, right, that was the first thing I thought of. And from day one. And then I just started seeing the case unfold and how all these people were cleared right away. And I studied forensic psychology, and 100% of forensic investigators would say a violent crime, a brutal crime, typically indicates that the victims knew their killer or had
Right.
some
Especially with a
connection to
knife.
them.
Yeah.
That's a
Yeah.
universal principle of forensics. And another principle is like the people that were last seen with the victims while they were alive.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
just thought it was very strange that all these people that were close to them were cleared so quickly. And so right there, I start asking, well, why would you clear them so quickly? Right? Wouldn't this is a serious quadruple homicide? It's a crazy crime. Like what would be the reason why you would clear these people so quickly and not? And this is long before the 911 recording came out and the body cam footage, right? Which exposed a lot of inconsistencies. So that was sort of that was it from for me right from the start. That's what made me start trying to understand why. Why is this shaping up this way, and why so quickly is the mainstream media in lockstep on a narrative and
Yeah.
not questioning barely at all the 8 hour delay.
And I want to share just briefly what one of my earliest thoughts were on my premise early on. Now, when it first happened, I remember a buddy of mine telling me this was long before I got into YouTube and all with that, and I wasn't doing anything with that kind of stuff. And my friend was just talking about this quadruple homicide, and boy, you need to watch this show. And it was just purely for an interest thing. Like again, I wasn't doing a blog, I wasn't doing a YouTube channel. He's just like, you need to see this. This is a crazy story, and it happened where because I went to school at WSU. He's like, this has happened in our backyard. You should check this story out. And I didn't see much of interest at the time. It wasn't until later when the story came out that Brian Koberger was the suspect, and that he was a criminology student working on his PhD, and that he had studied under Kathleen Ramsland, who wrote the book on BTK. And my first thought, really, really early on, was, oh my God, what if this guy literally is writing his doctoral thesis by proving that he knows so much about criminology that he can pull this off and get away with it, that he had learned so much that this was essentially his way of doing a twisted doctoral thesis. I'll show you how good I am. I know how to do this and get away with it. And that was one of my first thoughts. Now, I did move away from that eventually as thinking that was the primary thing, but I'll just admit that's one of the first places I went. But that's when I started getting intrigued, like, oh my God. And I started looking for those connections. You were looking at the drug connections, right, a little bit. And then this thing just took a life of its own and kind of I know I'm talking a lot, but when you were talking about primary motivations, well, if it's a knife thing, it's somebody that knows them. I likewise was like, well, when there was all this talk about Kaylee and the ex-boyfriend and how she just broke up with them and had to die, and I was like, well, the number one thing in all stories is you look first at the spouse, you look first at the romantic relationship, who just broke up with somebody and was distraught. So I started looking at Jack DeCoeur very, very early on, thinking, wait a minute, again, rule number one. If you have a homicide, look at the spouse first. Now, granted, he wasn't the spouse, but he was the ex-boyfriend who was jilted and left. So the story just took on a life of its own, and it became enormous.
Right. Yeah. And I started to look at it. Okay, they caught this guy, and the first thing that I thought of once they caught Koberger was, this is not his first crime, right? Because again, forensics serial killers tend to escalate, right? Their crimes escalate as they go.
Right.
And so that was initially what I thought. I didn't think like, oh, this is not the guy. I thought, all right, this is the guy, but the chances are this is not his first series of crimes. Like there's got to be stuff connected to him. And that's just based on what I know from reading a lot of profiling books and learning the basics of forensics, more so forensic psychology. I didn't study like criminology or forensic investigating. It was more specific to profiling based on psychological things. But that was my initial feeling. And then as things started to play out and I started to see that there were a lot of gaps in the story, like this guy has no history of violent crime. And then it was truly, honestly, the main thing that really made me start questioning on a deeper level that he was the guy or the sole perpetrator was the lockstep narrative by the media. That was the thing that made me start questioning.
Yeah. Well, and here's the thing, like, unfortunately, I feel like we kind of have to wrap up pretty quickly here so that I can have some time for our files to upload and some of that. But this is just scratching the surface. One of the things that you and I learned when we were talking in that bar that night, you made the comment and I agreed. the way that this conversation is going, and as fast as we're talking, and as many things that we're hitting, we literally could be talking for 8 hours straight, and we wouldn't probably still be scratching the surface. You and I have a lot of things that we know in the top of our head that just haven't spewed out on a video or whatever. Joe, you and I are going to do some really big things on this show. I think we're going to get into some really, really deep topics, and it's not for everyone, which is why I kind of said when we do this, when we formulate a show, let's get into those foundational things and some really deep topics, but let's not do it too often because it's not a show for everyone. It's going to be something that needs to be kind of taken in bite-sized chunks. And I know that one of the things you said too is let's not be too overly serious. Let's allow it to be a little light because it can't all be all serious. But that's what we're going to do, you and I, right? Is we're going to focus on the deep foundational shit and really dive into it at a deeper level. You want to talk more about your thoughts for that?
Yeah, I think that again, we're going to touch on a variety of things. I think we're definitely going to talk about some of the true crime stuff for sure. But I think some of the things that I would like to introduce that we've discussed is just how what we're talking about relates to true crime. And
Yeah.
it really has
Yeah.
a lot to do with the media's role in shaping narratives. And again, this is not going to be a political show, but there are some politics involved because you can't avoid it. The media loves to play on politics, right?
Right.
And
Can't talk
so,
about
yeah,
Charlie Kirk without getting into politics.
yeah, of course, yeah, and so yeah, this is just sort of an intro, um, testing the waters a little bit, see how we want to approach things. And I'm not an experienced streamer, so it's good for me to break the ice a little bit. And then we
I
can,
think you did great. You're spot on. I mean, other than some a little bit of freezing of our video, which we'll work out the kinks and the details on that. But I think it's great. I think we're doing a really good start here to what we've got going.
yeah, it's fun, and I'm glad that I met you. I'm glad we got a chance to really get into some heavy discussions about things. And I do believe we sort of are kindred spirits in a lot of ways. And I think we have our own way of delivering things, which I think is a good thing.
Yeah, and so I recommend you guys really look forward to our next thing. We'll start to Joe and I are going to start to do topics like we might have like deep state or we might have psyop or whatever, and we're going to kind of like focus on a particular subject and really break it down, maybe recommend some books, right, that can be read that will inform you of that if you want deeper things, maybe recommend some documentaries if you like a little faster pace. But we'll talk about these in detail, and we'll always try to bring it back, or at least my intent is to always kind of bring it back to some of those cases that are going on now, like the Idaho 4, like the Charlie Kirk situation, Luigi Mangione. I'm covering these stories, and I'll try to always find the tie-ins as we're talking about these deep foundational issues about where do we see this foundational issue appearing in the stories that we're covering today, so that you can understand that a little bit better in our perspective of those things. Anything you want to say on the way out today? Because again, we need to kind of wrap this up and get some of this video processing done. Anything you want to say on the way out?
No, just that I look forward to diving into stuff, and I'm gonna do my work. I'm gonna make sure that I have stuff that I can present in a way that's not going to put people to sleep, and also I'm sure things will evolve as we go. Like the Charlie Kirk thing popped up, while we were
Yeah.
communicating about doing this. And I said to you, this is the biggest story in the world. And this was like
Yeah.
this is literally, I think you and I spoke like within a few hours after it happened.
Yes.
And I've dug into it quite a bit. We've all seen the variety of videos and things going around and the theories going around. And I've written a little bit about it. I just started writing a piece on Substack that's going to be a longer piece that kind of gets more into how I got into learning about this stuff and kind of a piggyback off of what we're talking about now.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm excited. I'm really excited about the future of this. Because we didn't get too deep into anything, it's not necessarily the best example of what the show is going to be like, but it's a teaser. I wanted you to get to know Joe. I wanted you to understand him as a face and as a man and hear his voice and his presentation. JJ, you've got, he writes under JJ at State of the Deep. It's stateofthedeep.substack.com. Is that the URL for your Substack account?
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, so he's got that. I've got, of course, devilsdocket.substack.com for my thing. But he and I are gonna, I believe Joe and I are gonna do some big things going forward. We've got a lot of things going on up here, which we will spew out here. And I think you're going to learn a lot. I think you'll get a lot of it. And again, there was an individual who was with us at CrimeCon, and I swear, like, I don't want to be too braggy, but her jaw was on the ground just listening to Joe and I riff on stuff. Like, where the hell do you guys know all this stuff from? There's a think tank up here, and Joe and I are going to have a lot of things to say, and I think you're going to learn a lot. So thanks for coming on, Joe. I'm looking forward to this collaboration. It's going to be great. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me, man. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to getting back at it.
Have a good night, everybody.
Bye, everybody.